Hello there. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to this second in my series of podcasts. And today's guest, I first met him at a local Reform branch meeting a few months ago, and then had the pleasure of driving up to Birmingham together to the national conference. And I don't know about you, but I don't particularly enjoy long motorway journeys. You know, they're incredibly boring, quite tedious. But I have to say, with having the pleasure of my guest sitting next to me, that the journey absolutely flew. And what an incredible guy this is. Really interesting background, really interesting stories to tell. So I thought I'd invite him along to a podcast. So I'll just bring him in to the studio. And if I can
Hello.
introduce to you Mr. Tony Brown. Hi, Tony. How are you?
Hi, I'm fine. I'm good. And thank you for giving me this opportunity.
Absolute pleasure. Absolute pleasure. So I thought maybe it would be useful first just for you to introduce yourself and kind of give your background and let us know, what your story has been.
Well, I suppose I have to begin back at university. I went to Cambridge and I read history. And unlike many of my contemporaries who immediately went to the left, I went to what is now called or was called the right, mainly in the belief that Adam Smith has far more to tell us, which is useful about how to grow an economy, than Karl Marx does. So I'm very much of that side of the coin, and I occasionally, to the cognoscenti, say that I'm part of the Austrian School of Economics. And the Austrian school believe that nothing has an innate or natural or fair value, that the price of everything, the value of everything, is entirely dependent upon the context. And I think that the Labour government that we currently got is busy discovering that in the form of Rachel Reeves, the reaction to some of Rachel Reeves' measures. I was for many, many years an active conservative. I was a conservative councillor in Ealing for 12 years, from 1994 to 2006. I was a Conservative parliamentary candidate a couple of times, once for Europe, once for Westminster. But I decided that the Conservatives were leaving me. What I mean by that is that they were going woke. They were adopting climate change. And of course, the Climate Change Act was introduced by Theresa May, not by the Labour Party. And I decided that their tax and spend, heavy regulation approach was the opposite of everything I believed in and stood for. So I looked around to find somebody who reflected what I was thinking, and I was delighted to discover Nigel Farage. At that stage, he was part of UKIP, so I instantly joined UKIP and had the honour and pleasure of finding myself being interviewed to go and work as one of his policy advisors in the European Parliament. I went there in 2010. I was there for 10 years. And my biggest claim to fame there is that Nigel was kind enough to describe me as one of his speechwriters. Now, those were his very words after he'd heard me address a dinner where he was part of the audience. That's quite unusual. Now, I must be honest with you. Nigel doesn't really have a speechwriter because, unlike most politicians, he originates all his own material. The way I would brief him would be he'd mention a topic to me, call me in, we'd chat for 10 or 15 minutes. He's one of the best listeners you will ever come across, a far better listener than most politicians. And I would brief him. give him my thinking. He would let me flow. He didn't interrupt me very much at all, except with a very occasional question. I'd then watch him make perhaps a few notes, as few as half a dozen words on a piece of paper, and then he'd thank me for my contribution. And then the next day or a couple of days later or whenever, I would hear some of what I said to him reproduced by him as part of his speech. So no, I wasn't really a speechwriter, despite having the honor of being called it by Nigel. But he did ask me to do some drafting for him. And so there's a booklet here called Not Worth the Paper. This was the booklet produced by his parliamentary group in the run-up to the UK referendum, and I'm proud to say that I did the first draft. He asked me if I would, and we then went through it, and he was delighted with the result, which went out and was widely distributed. Now, the point about being in UKIP is that everybody, the Conservatives, the Labour Party, the Guardian, the BBC, wanted to present us as clowns, gadflies, cranks, fools, idiots. So that booklet got practically no coverage officially. But what I did notice was that, particularly on the BBC, they stole chunks of it without attribution to provide the briefing which they were using for program settings, introductions, and that kind of thing. And Nigel and I discussed this, and we agreed that we were delighted, because the fact is, even though we weren't getting the attribution, it meant that it was our narrative that was providing the backdrop and the fundamentals of the way the situation was being assessed. So we regarded the booklet as a great success. I went on to do other writing for him and his colleagues. I also wrote this one, which is called Stolen Seas, which was an account of how damaging the common fisheries policy on which I worked in the Parliament is and was to the British fishing industry, and why we should never have joined it in the first place. So I was active in the European Parliament for 10 years, right up to the point at which we left. Nigel went through several incarnations. He went from UKIP, he resigned from UKIP, and I had resigned from UKIP too within 12 hours of his resignation, because I discovered that that was the case. I supported the Brexit Party, and indeed I was an advisor to some of the Brexit Party MEPs, including Rupert Lowe, who's now a Reform Member of Parliament. And obviously, I'm now very much in Reform and very much support the approach. And I believe that it's the only approach which can give this country both the growth that it very much needs and the policy approach which will give us a better future.
So going back to your 10 years as a political advisor in Europe, which is, fair chunk of time, tell us a bit more about what other things you did, what you got involved with. I think you were involved in sort of various committees and various areas of work.
Yes, I mean, the work of the European Parliament is essentially to modify what the Commission produces. In most parliamentary systems, or in most government systems, it is the legislators themselves who produce the first draft of the legislation. The EU was different from that. The Commission produced the first draft of everything, and then it went through what amounted to an approval process, which could often be little more than a rubber stamping process, so that it appeared democratic when it wasn't. Now, the drafts that were produced by the Commission, they went to the council, which represented the national ministers, and then they went to the MEPs, who were directly elected from the member state concerned. And a lot of my work consisted of analysing what was coming from the Commission to the committees, and then advising the MEPs who were on that committee what it said, what they might say as a comment on it in speeches, and also preparing for them the voting lists, because all of this draft legislation was subject to a massive number of amendments which were being put down in order to try to modify it. I may say that very few of the amendments were successful unless the Commission itself wanted them to be successful. And in that sense, and I sort of half admired the EU for this. It gave every appearance of democracy, and all those who were in favor of it could say, yes, it's a very democratic organization. Everything is considered by ministers and by directly elected MEPs, and it was all technically true. But in practice, the ability to alter any of it, and certainly alter it significantly, and above all, the ability to stop it, because the whole thing was considered damaging, these were virtually impossible.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I guess you were in the very heart of the beast of the European Union.
Some of my colleagues used to say with a grin on their face that we were in the belly of the beast. And it's true. We were, and the kind of briefings that I was talking about, I drafted a lot of speeches for different MEPs, and I occasionally say that for someone who never officially opened his mouth in the Parliament, an awful lot of my words were reproduced and can be heard, but just not coming from me.
Yes. What's your response to the claim made by some people that are more pro-EU than the likes of you and I, who say, actually, if we'd stayed in it, we could have influenced it to our benefit, and therefore in the round, ended up in a more beneficial situation than ultimately upping and leaving?
David Cameron, in fairness to him, tried. And the failure of his renegotiation to get anything substantial, bearing in mind that at least some of the other member states wanted us to stay in, and therefore, in a certain sense, wanted to make as many concessions as they could to what David was asking for. But David couldn't extract anything useful. I mean, there's a great chunk of this booklet at the back, a double-page spread, which it talks in that spread less to this than meets the eye about Dave's attempt at renegotiation. And then it goes on to talk about Dave's disastrous ditch. And what we meant by that was that he outlined 10 pledges to the British people, and he delivered none of them. Mm-hmm. And the point is that the structure of the whole thing was unreformable unless the Commission wanted it reformed that way. And therefore, people who claim that, we could have influenced it, we could have changed it, they simply demonstrate they don't know nothing in practice about how it really is.
Mm-hmm. I mean, as we all remember, David came back with crumbs, frankly, from the table after that negotiation. So would you not necessarily personally hold David Cameron responsible for that poor outcome? And is it because ultimately the system, the being would simply have not allowed anything more?
Yes. I do hold him responsible, though like Nigel, I'm grateful to him for presenting the opportunity for the referendum. Now, I have to say that one of the first booklet I did for Nigel was this, and it was about how referendums operate in the European Union, and it's called A Referendum Stitch Up, and the subtitle is How the EU and British Elites Are Plotting to Fix the Result. Now, we were doing something just, I hope, a little bit subtle in that booklet, because we were telling Dave that he could probably go ahead with a referendum and be confident of winning it. And it is certainly the case that he only proceeded on the basis that he and George Osborne believed that they would win. And I think Dave was genuinely shocked when he learned the result. And if you remember what then happened, he had earlier been asked that if the result went the wrong way from his point of view, if we voted to leave, whether he would stay in power. And he said the usual nonsense about, my country will need me to manage that situation. Instead of which, within literally an hour or so, perhaps 2 hours of the result becoming clear, he's on the steps of Downing Street resigning. And that was both going back on his previous word, and therefore, in the eyes of many people, many of them on his own side, really rather dishonorable behavior.
Mm-hmm. Do you think simply he and the people with him had not fathomed that the outcome could have been as it was, and therefore had no preparation, no planning for that eventuality?
I very much agree with that. There was certainly no planning for that eventuality. Indeed, when we who were on the Leave side tried to suggest in advance that there should be a civil service plan for the result going our way, we were pretty bluntly informed that it wasn't going to go our way, and therefore no planning was necessary. And one of the catastrophic misjudgments of David Cameron's Conservative government was to do no planning in advance whatsoever for the vote to go the way it did and for the country to leave the EU. And that is why the day after we'd voted to leave, we were in deep trouble, because the result was so unanticipated that they hadn't really given a moment's thought to how leaving should be progressed. And the EU, which you'll begin to get an impression from some of the things I say, that I have a quiet admiration for them. They're a bit Machiavellian. They know what they're doing. They've been in this game a long time. And the British government, Dave's government, were unbelievably naive. And in the subsequent negotiations, the EU was always coming from a position of strength. It had thought about these things. It already had drafts prepared, and it kept the British government, jumping around like some victim of a playground bully. But I'm not blaming the EU for doing its job properly. The EU was efficient and competent, and the British Conservative government was inefficient, incompetent, and unprepared.
So with that, shall I describe it as quiet admiration for the EU?
Yes, I mean, when I studied history, I was engaged in sort of 2 or 3 quite interesting processes. One is always counterfactuals. Counterfactuals are what would have happened if. What would have happened if Harold had won the Battle of Hastings? What would have happened if Nelson had lost at Trafalgar? These kind of things. And in order to write a good historical analysis, you have to understand what is significant and why. And that means understanding at least something of what might have happened if it had gone the other way. So that's the first thing. But the second is, when dealing with those who are your opponents, and I deliberately use the word opponents rather than enemies, you can have quiet admiration for their competence, even whilst they are winning. And, you know, one of the things that I tried to do when I was in the EU, working in the EU, was to explain just how efficient and Machiavellian the Commission and the institutions were, and how the British, if they weren't very careful with their long-standing sense of fair play, were going to have rings run around them by these guys who were playing by a rather different set of rules.
Mm-hmm. No, I completely agree. In an effective, successful scenario of democracy, you know, having that degree of respect for your opposition, as you say, not your enemy, is actually a very good thing, and that creates a very healthy scenario of democracy. But unfortunately, you know, if we sort of kind of think about the British government and the parliamentary situation at the moment, that's probably not how we would describe the current situation. That you know, either due to the relevant relative competencies, or just the whole dynamic of communication, debate, and dialogue that the world seems to be moving towards, you know, in a much more polarized sort of sense of the world.
I think you raise a very important point, and it goes to the heart of what's currently going on. The liberal social democratic order, which has been running the West for quite a while now in most places, seems to have forgotten its own voters. So you see in a whole number of areas that, you know, the interests of Britain, the interests of British people seem to take second place to a feeling that they have to serve the greater good of the planet. You see this over climate change, where Ed Miliband's policies, which, and I have to emphasize this, the climate change was a Conservative act, and Ed Miliband is merely building on the opportunities that the Conservatives created for him. So both the major parties, the traditional major parties, are responsible. And it's a disaster for our economy, for our prospects of growth. We've just gone through a cold spell, and renewables don't work on cold, still, windless, overcast days. You know, there's no solar power, there's precious little wind power, and we've had to pay millions of pounds to our remaining gas-fired energy plants in order to keep warm and keep factories running and that kind of thing. So, you know, it's an economic disaster, and my opposition to Labour and the Tories over climate change is not one of principle, it's one of practice. They're impoverishing us. And I mean, it's the same with EVs. They don't seem to understand that people won't buy EVs until they see it as being advantageous. And it isn't advantageous. These are more expensive vehicles with less flexibility and so on. The same applies to heat pumps. The same applies to the environmental regulations that they're imposing on housing and landlords and so on. All of this stuff is making our lives more expensive, stopping the growth that they say they want, and it's a disaster for the country. And I have to say, the same applies both to immigration and to wokeness. The country, the case against mass immigration is a practical one. It means that our GNP per capita is declining. It's not growing. We are literally getting poorer as a result of mass immigration. And the same applies to what I will describe as wokeness, diversity, equalities. When your HR department is much more concerned about whether you've employed the right number of women as against men, or whether you've met quotas or requirements or targets for particular types of people, it takes its eye off the ball of what is the first job of business, which is to make a profit so it can pay good salaries and so the country can grow richer. And I want to make this completely clear. I am a believer in Nigel's approach, and I am a believer in reform because I believe it is what is necessary in order for us to prosper and have better lives. I don't oppose any of this stuff on principle, but that's why I sort of began by referring to the thinker Adam Smith, because what Adam Smith understood was, there's a famous quote from Adam Smith, and I sort of apologize for this, but he says it's not from the benevolence that the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker supply light and our dinner. It is because it is in their self-interest. And he describes this as the invisible hand of capitalism. He doesn't use the word capitalism. It's the invisible hand of the market. And markets deliver. And any student of history over the last 200 or 300 years can see how it is market-based economies in Europe, in North America, in Australia, New Zealand, and so on, that have prospered. And it is socialist economics, whether in Argentina and Venezuela, whether in the Soviet Union, which is a catastrophe for the living standards and the quality of life of the people in those countries. And therefore, the reason I advocate reform is because I want myself, my wife, my 2 sons, I want them to have a better future. And that future requires economic growth and economic success. And the only way to produce that is by having a market-based economy with pricing structures which are based on what the market tells you.
And as you rightly said a moment ago, you know, there's hardly a tissue paper's width between the current Labour Party and Conservative Party on so many of those issues, whether it's the woke agenda, the EDI agenda, the green agenda, even the economic agenda in many respects. So, you know, it's the one thing that George Galloway said that I actually hold a lot of agreement with, that they are different cheeks of the same backside.
Yeah, I mean, this goes back to Tony Blair. I think that historians of the future, when they are writing the kind of essay that I wrote at Cambridge, will identify common themes running from Blair through Cameron and then through May, right up to the present day. And broadly, the only way you can reject this horrible social democratic consensus, which has been supported over the whole of this century, indeed this millennium, by both the Conservatives and the Labour Party, is by voting for reform. And as for the Liberal Democrats, the Greens, and so on, their position basically is that the Labour Party and the Tory Party, when in power, don't go far enough. They want more climate change measures. They want more diversity and equality policies. They want more or to maintain the very current high levels of immigration. So there's only one vote which counts if you don't like what the political class, the establishment, is doing, and that's to vote for reform. And that's why I'm in it.
Yeah, absolutely agreed. So going back again to your time in Europe, you mentioned Rupert Lowe earlier. Now, obviously, he's currently one of the 5 MPs that Reform have in Parliament, and he's going down very, very well with people. I continually hear people giving tremendous praise to him. Whenever he's giving speeches, whenever he's asking questions on the floor of the House of Commons, his social media record. So interested to know or hear a bit more about what he was like as a man to work with in Europe.
A delight. I obviously I had many jobs before I went to the European Parliament, and as far as I'm concerned, the European Parliament, working in the European Parliament for Nigel and his group and his MEPs, is the best job I've ever had, the most fun I've ever had at work, and Rupert is a perfect example of this. I mean, he was only an MEP for 7 months. He had the agriculture brief, but he wasn't actually on the agriculture committee. So what he asked me to do was to attend the agriculture committee, which I could do as a policy advisor, and then report back to him on anything that I considered important. I did that. And then we decided what, if anything, we wanted to put out as a result. And he asked me to write or begin drafting actually a couple of papers for him, one on agriculture and international trade, and the other on the operation of something which is almost forgotten now, but was very much in the headlines a few years ago, which is something called Target 2. And Target 2 has nothing to do with targets or targeting. It's a reference to the financial clearinghouse between Euro member states, so that when a payment is made from Greece to Germany, or vice versa, Target 2 is the clearing mechanism which underlies this. And I did, in fact, complete drafts of papers on both, but they were only going to proceed if, for some reason, we didn't leave when we did. But it meant that I have considerable respect for Rupert. Actually, he's my kind of chap, because I have a bit of a tendency on occasion to quote Latin and to come across as a bit of an intellectual, perhaps a weakness. It doesn't go down well with everybody. But, Rupert's excellent speech at the party conference, the one we attended together in Birmingham, he made, as I'm sure you'll remember, he quoted Socrates. And I am very familiar with Socrates. In fact, I wrote political thought essays about Plato and Aristotle, but I didn't recognize the quote. So I sent Rupert a text or a WhatsApp message saying, "Rupert, what's the source of your Socrates quote?" And he came back to me. And so, yeah, I'm a great fan of Rupert, and I think he has that skeptical cast of mind, which means that he's able to ask the right questions, to tease out the information about what's going on, which the government doesn't want you to know, because actually it reflects no credit on the government and what it's achieving. So Rupert was, in summary, a delight to work for, and you can't get a better MEP or MP.
Absolutely, and I think a lot of people are thinking that. So let's move on to the main man then, Mr. Nigel Farage, and he's clearly got many incredible strengths which we can talk about. But the first one I wanted to kind of highlight is his giving of speeches. He is an incredible orator. He doesn't use notes. He's not reading from the script that so many other politicians do continually, including our current Prime Minister. How does he do it? How does he achieve that?
Right. The first thing is that he has a phenomenal memory. When you are working for him, he says, on that, can you ring X? And you think, I don't know who X is. and then he'll say off the top of his head, without even checking it, "Oh, his number is," and you take down the number, and you think, how on earth can he remember that with everything else he's remembering? So he's got a phenomenal memory. He also is one of the best listeners I've come across. There's an old political joke that politicians are always on transmit and never on receive, and they don't seem to understand that you have one mouth but two ears for a reason. Nigel, in my experience, was the opposite of that. He would let me talk with him, if I'm honest, almost at him in the way that I am here. He wouldn't interrupt me unless he had a very specific question, which was about something that I'd said. And he would absorb it almost by a sort of magic mental osmotic process. And the result is that when he stands up to speak, he doesn't need notes because he's got so much in his head available on instant recall. And he also is very good at spotting in advance what is going to come down the line. And one of the things he wanted to call the Commission's attitude to the Greeks at the time of the Greek economic crisis. He wanted to refer to them as commissars and Gauleiters. And he anticipated that this will go down, really badly. And so he called me in a few hours before he was going to make the speech. And he said, when one of the MEPs, probably Elmar Brok, stands up to say that what I've said is disgraceful and I can't compare the EU to the Nazi or the Soviet regimes, what's my response? And I said, well, I think that you need to show that the British at times with their empire did pretty much exactly the same thing. And he said, example. And I said, the Don Pacifico affair. And he said, tell me about it. And I said, well, actually on this one, can you give me literally 5 minutes to pop back to my office? So I Googled Don Pacifico because I just wanted to check the facts. Yeah. And to cut a long story short, we'd effectively won Greek independence at the Battle of Navarino, which was delivered to them by a kindly British, French, Russian naval victory over the Ottoman Empire. And we therefore expected that our people would be treated decently. And Don Pacifico was a Maltese guy, but he had a British passport. And he was thrown into jail in Athens because he was asking to be paid money, which he was owed from Greece. And when Palmerston found out about this, he ordered a bit of gunboat diplomacy, and we went and bombarded the port of Athens until they released Don Pacifico and he got his money. And so when Nigel stood up, exactly as Nigel anticipated, even down to the MEP, it was Elmar Brok, who was a German MEP, who stood up and said, you can't say things like that. And Nigel chuckled and said, oh, I'm pretty broad in my condemnation of things. It reminds me of what the British did over the Don Pacifico affair when they bombarded the port of Athens until this man was released. So, we all have things in our past. The difference is that you're doing it today. And, it worked. And the secret to Nigel is, in my view, his phenomenal memory, his ability to listen and then absorb large amounts of information, and then to get it right when he stands up and speaks, as you say, without needing a prompter or notes or anything. And also, the other thing, which many politicians don't have, Nigel believes in telling the truth as he sees it. He has, it may sound odd, I described him on one occasion in the Parliament as having what you might call a sentimental attachment to the truth. He is not, on the whole, prepared to say things that he doesn't believe because it's tactically helpful. And indeed, one of the keys to understanding Nigel is that he doesn't like being lied to, and he doesn't like being taken for a fool. And his belief was that the entire British political class was, has, and is still taking the British public for fools, and if not actually lying to them, misleading them in the information that it chooses to put across.
Absolutely, which is one of the many reasons why trust in our, general trust in our politicians is so painfully low, because that level of trust and confidence that they're telling the truth, that they're being consistent and not flip-flopping from one week to the next, is just fallen dramatically.
Oh, I mean, this brings us back to Rupert Lowe. Rupert Lowe is teasing out with his information requests and his parliamentary questions, information which is there, but which the government wants to keep buried. And migration figures, the number of crimes committed by migrants, the deportation rate of migrants who commit crimes, all of these are information which is available and it is correct, but the government doesn't want you to know it because it's extremely embarrassing for their immigration policy, in the same way that the figures on energy costs are deeply embarrassing for their climate change policies. So, what Rupert is doing, is we are digging out the truth, which the government wants to conceal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I guess another, even more recent example is that the debate that we had in the Houses of Parliament this week around calls for a national investigation into the child rape scandal, where the Labour Party, the party in government, had a 3-line whip, and I'd say all of its members voted against this proposal, except for practically all of the cabinet, who all abstained, including the Prime Minister. Now, I simply cannot imagine in a reform government, Nigel Farage abstaining from a vote that he told all the rest of his MPs to vote for.
Oh, and Nigel was strong on this. One of the things that you have to do when you work in the European Parliament is prepare all the voting lists. In other words, you are recommending how the MEPs should vote. And Nigel showed both the importance that he attached to this and his genuine belief in discussion and democracy in the way he ran the group, because he allowed flexibility of voting. Suppose, for instance, that the Czech or the Italian, for good historical reasons, wanted to vote in a different way from us, then that was allowed. But when it came to his own MEPs, unlike most of the groups in the Parliament, when it came to voting in a full plenary session in Strasbourg, usually, but occasionally in Brussels, they would just be handed a voting list. There would be no discussion about it. They were effectively being told how to vote. If you were on the EFD staff, you prepared the voting list in advance, you gave a 1-line reason for your recommendation, and then there was a voting meeting with the MEPs all invited to be present. I say invited because occasionally one or two of them couldn't turn up. They were perhaps speaking in the chamber or whatever.
Yeah.
And then there was discussion of the voting recommendation. And we as staff knew that if we weren't on our toes, if we couldn't give a completely rational, excellent explanation for our voting recommendation, we were going to be in trouble. And no names, no pack drill, but I watched at least one colleague prepare a voting list. He was then cross-questioned about it, and he lost his job the following day. That may sound a bit harsh, but it shows that we were under a far more demanding degree of scrutiny than many of our colleagues, and that Nigel was committed to proper democracy, proper consensus, and allowing everybody to have their say.
Yes. Another one of Nigel's tremendous strengths, which you and I have talked about before, is his strategic thinking, his strategic planning. An immense strength that I think is, head and shoulders above any other current politician that we can think of, and certainly in the UK.
And that's not just our opinion. One of the close observers of UKIP and Nigel and the EFD was the Channel 4 journalist Michael Crick. Now, Michael Crick works for Channel 4. He had interaction with Godfrey Bloom, which led to Godfrey Bloom being asked to leave the group.
Departing.
And the party. There was no harder critic of Nigel and us than Michael Crick. Michael Crick has written a biography of Nigel. I have read that biography, and I can tell you that Michael's conclusion is that Nigel is the most important and most effective politician that has so far operated in the UK and arguably even possibly Europe this century. And he's the one that's achieved the most. Now, that's an opinion coming from one of Nigel's sternest critics. Nigel is a brilliant strategist, and I can't resist saying that one of the pleasures of working for him was having the opportunity to discuss strategy with him, because at least with me, he was the least arrogant boss you could imagine. He would ask my opinion. Oh, what do you think, Tony, we should do about this? And so on. And, he went through a process of thought and analysis, and only then arrived at his strategic conclusions. And for those of us that had the privilege of working for him in the way that I did, it was a real pleasure to be watching and working with a great mind and a great political strategist, thinker at work.
Mm-hmm. So when, and I'm going to use the word when, not if, when Nigel enters number 10 as our Prime Minister in 2029, if not before, what type of Prime Minister do you think he'll be?
I think he will be one who delegates. He is not in the business of having a dog and barking himself. That's not. He knows that when you get into number 10, you have to have worked out what you are planning to do. Now, I think I have a pretty good idea of what his 3 or 4 of his key early measures will be, because the disaster that is the Climate Change Act, the disaster that is the 2010 Equalities Act, the disaster that is our current policies on immigration, you have to repeal those acts. So I would anticipate that the amongst the very first measures that he will be to announce a well thought through legislative program, key parts of which simply involve unwinding what the Labour and Conservative parties have inflicted on us. And so, I anticipate that we will see the repeal of 2 or 3 key acts. And once they are gone, we can allow the market to operate. And what I mean by that is this. Let's say you repeal the Climate Change Act. No one is saying that if businesses want to build wind farms, they shouldn't be allowed to. What we are saying is it shouldn't be compulsory. And that's the market in operation. And what I think Nigel will do is he will have a clear plan to repeal the legislation which allows the market to operate and which means we stop having to pay over the odds for everything, and we stop imposing rules which are frankly unhelpful, unnecessary, and limiting. And just to say on the subject of diversity and equality, I actually believe that we're already there. We are already probably the fairest, the most diverse, the most equal in terms of equality before the law, without any kind of prejudice, that it's possible to go. We've won. We've done it. And what is happening is that our businesses, our institutions are being forced to waste time, energy, and effort doing things which are counterproductive. So what I think Nigel will understand is that we have to stop doing things which damage us, allow the market to operate, restore choice across the board, and in restoring choice, we can end subsidies, which allows the reduction in taxes. I mean, one of the points that everybody forgets when people say that reform doesn't have an economic plan which would work, if you repeal the Climate Change Act, you can axe all the energy subsidy and all of it. And you simply say to the energy suppliers, do what makes commercial sense. I mean, one of the most catastrophic decisions that the current government Labour government is making is to end production in the North Sea of oil and gas. It should be allowed. I mean, on this, Trump was completely right when he said a few days ago that Ed Miliband is massively damaging the UK economy. And Trump's right about this. The way you reduce energy prices is by saying to energy businesses, you do what makes economic sense, and all we're going to do is have a competition authority to ensure that the prices that are then charged by you are the lowest that they can sensibly be, and you aren't operating as a cartel or price gouging or whatever. Yes. And one of the other things about Nigel, which I've discussed with him, which I believe he understands, is there is one form of intervention in the market which is useful and necessary sometimes. And that is that for consumers to have the lowest possible prices, you have to give the maximum choice to business, but you then have to ensure that business is genuinely competing and that it isn't operating in a corporatist cartel to keep prices high. And therefore, I would hope and anticipate that a reform government would pay particular attention to the competition authority. And instruct the competition authority to ensure pretty much across the board that consumer prices are as low as they possibly can be.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. The Competition and Markets Authority, the CMA, is one very, very essential part of the civil service that needs, well, is doing and needs to continue doing a very, very important job. What do you think will personally be for Nigel the greatest challenges when he steps into those shoes as RPM?
One of the strengths of Nigel when he was in the Parliament was that he had a clear goal which could be understood, stated, and delivered. You are either in the European Union or you are not. You can be unhappy about your terms of trade with it once you're out, but you're either in it or you're out. Yeah. And he said, my goal is to get us out. He succeeded in getting us out, and now we are out. That's at least easy to understand. It's not easy to do. In fact, everybody said it was impossible, but it is easy to understand. The problem with being Prime Minister is the complexity of the interactions of all the things that you're dealing with. I think, in fact, that one of the mistakes that the Labour Party is making and the Tory made before it is that it didn't understand that the priority has to be growth and raising people's living standards. So I think that Nigel will be clear-sighted about what the goal is. And that puts him head and shoulders above recent prime ministers. But having said that, how you deliver that, as Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng discovered, is really quite complicated. So I think it'll be the biggest challenge of his life. I think he will approach it with the utmost clarity of thought, as much as any person can. Yes. But that's not to underestimate the difficulty.
Absolutely. And it's really about managing those expectations, because there will be such a mountain of work. So, prioritizing that and then being really clear, because, if you're not, there could be some very, very disappointed people.
Yes, you're absolutely right. And I'll be totally honest with you. Whether as an MP, whether as a SPAD, by the way, is simply the UK equivalent of the policy advisor role that I had in Brussels. I would like, if possible, to be part of trying to achieve that, because I think that I hope that this discussion has shown that I have some useful ideas to contribute in what needs to be done and the more difficult task of how you do it.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Tony. That's been fascinating. Well, certainly I found it fascinating. I'm sure lots of other people find it fascinating. I'm sure we could go on for hours, but we're approaching the hour point, so we probably should call it a day for now. But maybe you'd be happy to come back and talk some more another time.
Steve, as I hope I have shown in the discussion, I really enjoy talking with you. So anytime, just send me a WhatsApp message or whatever, arrange this, and I'll do it whenever you wish me to.
Wonderful. And thank you so much.
You are very kind to me, but from my point of view, it's been a delight to do it.
Agreed. Thanks very much. So until next time, everybody, cheerio.
Goodbye.